To Mourn by Tom Zuba. When it takes everything out of you just to breathe, when you wonder if another breath is even possible, when you feel yourself slipping away into the darkness, you are not alone. And I share that because this can be one of the loneliest experiences your client may be going through, and healing happens in community. And that community is going to look different for everyone, and it is there. To ground us in this topic, I think it's important to go over some definitions. We're not going to cover all of these, but I put them all here so that if you are interested and able in maybe doing some of this research afterwards and looking into more of these definitions, I think it really is important to show how many different types of loss we're talking about. Because if your client is experiencing either a pregnancy loss, a stillbirth, an early infant loss, etc., they may be learning about the definition right at the same time they're experiencing it. And we don't want to place that additional burden of them, educating you as the therapist regarding what they're going through. And it can be very, very grounding and helpful to know that you as the therapist are familiar, you're aware, you don't have to be a medical professional to have familiarity with these terms and to be able to navigate this and just say like, yes, I understand, I've got this. So perinatal losses, each type are unique. The term perinatal means pre and post. So we are talking about, when we use that umbrella term, we are talking about pregnancy and infancy. Miscarriage is the spontaneous loss of a pregnancy prior to 20 weeks gestation. Stillbirth, or the medical term fetal demise, is the loss that occurs after 20 weeks up to a full term loss. We're also looking at losses terminated due to genetic abnormalities and medical complications. Infant loss, or early neonatal death, is the death of a live-born infant within the first 7 days of life, whereas SIDS is a term that encompasses the loss of an infant or a baby within the first year of life. All of these are experienced and mourned in different ways, and throughout the rest of the hour, we will often use that umbrella term, perinatal loss. Today, we're going to primarily focus on stillbirth, miscarriage, stillbirth, and early infant loss. And we don't have too much time for stats, but I think they're helpful. So as I said, there are so many variations in types of losses, miscarriage being the most common. In fact, it's so common and it is underreported. 20 to 50% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. And also important to note that it doesn't necessarily have any indication on that person's ability to become pregnant again or carry a healthy pregnancy to term. It can be the natural course of a pregnancy due to chromosomal abnormalities. There are many reasons for a miscarriage, which we will touch on. It is the most common. The later in the gestational period, the lower the rates of loss are. About one pregnancy in 160 at 20 weeks of pregnancy and later is affected by stillbirth. In terms of age, we don't see very many consistent. There's not much that the statistics can tell us, except the greatest outliers are age, the youngest, and advanced maternal age being the greatest risk. And then finally, who does this affect the most? There are some risk factors that we will talk about in our next slide, and yet there's still so much research that needs to be done to determine what might cause a pregnancy or infant loss. One of the reasons is because this topic, although it is getting more widely discussed, is still not very widely discussed, and people don't research things that aren't being talked about. So there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. That being said, There are definite racial and socioeconomic disparities. For Black people, the stillbirth rate is more than double the rate than other groups, except when compared with American Indian and Alaska Native. And this is because of racism and systemic racism. People from racial or ethnic minority groups who live in a racist society are more likely to experience chronic stress, live in areas that have higher amounts of environmental toxins, have little or less access to healthcare. But it is really important to state clearly, being a person of color is not in and of itself a risk factor for pregnancy loss or stillbirth. However, communities of color are disproportionately affected by these types of losses, as well as maternal morbidity rates, because of racism and those social inequities. And in addition to that, research does show that Black women are less likely to be believed by their medical providers when they come to them with problems. So those are very dangerous trends. They are also very real trends that we need to be aware of. So I said, we don't know much about what can cause a miscarriage or a pregnancy loss. And that is true. And that also means that when people experience pregnancy loss, their first reaction is that of guilt and self-blame. If we don't know what caused something, we are going to turn to ourselves. And it's a natural reaction to go to blame first. I know I did. I know most of my clients do. In fact, just 2 nights ago, when I was preparing for this presentation, a dear friend called me. And truly, I was sitting down reading through my slides, and she called me to let me know that sadly she had experienced her second miscarriage in the last year. And she was calling both to tell me she was pregnant and to tell me about the loss, which is common, and like frequently how kind of people experience and deliver the news of an early pregnancy loss. And I share this now because she said her first reaction was blame and guilt. And then when she told her mom, who I want to share is a social worker, and she says usually knows just the right things to say, one of her mom's first questions is it the stress? Did the doctor say anything about, like, is it your job? Is it the stress? Is it like a stressful lifestyle? And that was so hurtful, because, of course, that was where her mind went first, too. And that was already what she was sitting with. And even though she knew, of course, it was not the stress, and every doctor has, for this loss and the previous loss, been very clear, stress does not cause pregnancy loss. It's not your fault. Hearing her mother say that back to her reinforced all of the shame, all of the guilt. She later used used interpersonal effectiveness to set boundaries with her mom, which is hopefully something we can touch on later on, this hour. And that's one of the reasons why guilt is such a common place to go. And it's not just something that the individual suffering the loss goes to first as well. So these are some of the many factors that may cause a pregnancy loss. What definitely does not is exercise. The same friend said, I was doing a lot of exercise during this pregnancy and the last. And they said that's not what caused it, but I don't know. If I get pregnant again, I'm going to do that differently next time. I won't be engaging in exercise. And the answer there, of course, is do what feels right for you, what feels right for your body, for your experience. And the general rule of thumb is, if it's exercise, if it's activities you were doing prior to the pregnancy, they are activities you can continue throughout your pregnancy. Sexual intercourse does not contribute to loss, and neither does working, provided you're not working in like you're not exposed to harmful chemicals or radiation. But certainly encourage your clients to talk to their doctor if they're concerned about any risks. And people often go to self-blame. And as the therapist, it's really Important to validate that guilt is there and it is unjustified guilt. So, we're likely all fairly familiar with working with grief and loss as therapists. And all of those skills and all of the work you've done in grief and loss will come in very handy when working with perinatal loss specifically. And there is a unique nature of perinatal loss. Let's break down the difference between mourning and grief, or grief and mourning, and then we can talk about how mourning is really affected differently, or the process of mourning is different in the perinatal period. Okay, so grief. Grief is the constellation of internal thoughts and feelings when someone we love dies.